This is a really wonderful occasion for me because not only is this city the home of my forefathers, although they spelled Gaffney the Irish Catholic way, not the Hebrew way. There are a lot of them here, as you may know. It is also one of the absolutely stellar events on my calendar anytime I get to be in the same room with a man I admire as much as I do Mort Klein. You obviously know him very well, and I'm sure you appreciate as much as I do the fact that he has, in a truly unique way, spoken for the Jewish people, spoken for Israel, spoken for all of us who love the Jewish people, despite themselves, love Israel, and not least understand how critical Israel is to the security of the rest of us in the free world. And his tirelessness, I was musing with him about how long we've known each other. I actually know him before he was the president of ZOA. I mean, that's before Christ almost. But it's wonderful to be here with him, and most especially, it's really a privilege to be speaking again to a ZOA audience. I did indeed receive the Brandeis Award, which was, well, the rest of my career has been downhill from there, I can tell you. It was really very, very moving to do so, and I appreciate the friendship and the solidarity that bespoke. It's not every day, you know, they say timing is everything. It's not every day that you get the President of the United States to sort of advance your speech for you. But he certainly has done a lot to help illuminate some of the points that I wanted to make with you. And before I turn to some of the things that he and his administration have done or revealed in the run-up to this trip and during the first day of his time in Israel, I wanted to share with you a story. I don't know if many of you know Bill Langfan. Does that name mean anything to you? Well, Mark is his son. Bill is a 91-year-old veteran, supporter of ZOA, of the cause of freedom, of World War II. And he mentioned to me when I met with him in Palm Beach a couple of weeks ago, veteran also of a very, very prescient campaign, unfortunately unsuccessful, to warn against Munich. And of course, Mort Klein just gave you a little bit of Winston Churchill's treatment of that sort of exemplary moment in the practice of appeasement that was, of course, the run-up to World War II. Well, Bill Langfan lived. At 91 years old, he remembers, as a 16-year-old, warning that the result of this kind of appeasement, what did it involve? Compelling, on the part of the great powers of the time, Britain and France, compelling a self-reliant and powerful ally to give up what? To give up strategic high ground critical to its security, in the hope that by so doing, it would buy what? Peace in our time. And he said, as a 16-year-old, it isn't going to work out. It can't possibly produce the desired result. And 7 years later, he was serving in Patton's Third Army when it liberated Buchenwald. And having fought through the Battle of the Bulge to get there, he'd already seen some of the horrors of war, to be sure. But he saw as vividly as one can conceive of the cost of Munich, in the living and in the dead of Buchenwald. And he spent most of the intervening years, he's told me, and particularly the 26 years or so since he retired, studying, trying to understand, and trying to teach the lessons of subsequent efforts on the part of the great power of our time, namely the United States. To induce, to cajole, to persuade, to coerce a self-reliant, powerful ally to give up, among other things, strategic high ground essential to its security. Does this sound familiar? Which brings me to President Obama's visit to Israel as we speak. Now, you doubtless have heard, as we all have, not to expect too much from this trip, right? No proposals, not much expectation of progress on the peace process. And yet, there have been some interesting and, frankly, quite ominous indications along the lines of what Mort talked about, of not only the abiding hostility of President Obama to the Jewish state, but of his determination to compel it to make progress once again, in the hope that that would somehow translate into peace in our time. I don't know if you caught this, but he actually used that phrase verbatim in his second inaugural address. I hardly think that's an accident. So let me just give you a couple of examples of the things that have been illustrative of his attitude and that of his administration and of his ambitions. I suspect on this trip, and certainly for the duration of his presidency, however long that might be. There was the map business. As you may have heard, the map of his visit to the Middle East showed Israel within what he likes to call the 67 lines. Not Israel reflecting the Golan Heights, not Israel reflecting what we've been enjoined from calling it the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, nor even, again, what we are not to call it, East Jerusalem. It's talking about an Israel that would actually even be bifurcated to enable passage between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, as they call it. This is not a positive sign. This is a map that differs not terribly much from some of the more benign of the Palestinian maps. Most of them, of course, don't have Israel on it at all. But at the very least, they certainly do not reflect the reality that Israel continues, thankfully, and again, I give Mort Klein and the ZOA no small amount of credit for this, to control territory critical to Israel's security, its ability to defend itself, and its ability to play the role that I suggested a moment ago it plays in our security interests, as well as its own. Aaron Klein, who you may read in WorldNet Daily, actually made it onto the Drudge Report today, had some reporting from his sources, which I think are generally pretty good, about what is actually expected to come out of this trip, or perhaps in the weeks or months to follow. But my guess is it'll be unveiled at some point after the president spends 5 hours with this chap, Mahmoud Abbas, who is, at least in Arabic, periodically in English, but always in Arabic, made clear his fealty to the commitment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, to say nothing of Hamas, to destroy the Jewish state. What will it look like, according to Aram's sources? They're going to get back into talks. Talks with the Palestinians about the two-state solution. Once these talks get underway, he says, or more to the point, his sources tell him, there will be a silent and undeclared freeze on Jewish settlements in both the West Bank and eastern Jerusalem, excluding the main blocks but even there, my guess is, you'll find reluctance to build more apartments, more settlements. And all of this is supposed to take place irrespective of the status of Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. And yet, the United States, as Aaron points out, is working with Qatar and Egypt and Jordan and Turkey to try to finish the much feared and long-awaited unity government between that terrorist organization and our so-called partners for peace, who actually, as I said, share the terrorist organization's desire to destroy the Jewish state. It is said that the administration, no surprise here, is coordinating actively with Tzipi Livni and her team, and that presumably what is underway is trying to fracture the newly announced Israeli government and exploit that fracture to put further pressure on Bibi Netanyahu to make precisely the sorts of concessions, including concessions of territory, so as to allow a greater sense of progress in the peace process. Now, I'm reasonably sure I do not need to tell a ZOA group how fraught with peril these indications of what is afoot are. What it means that Prime Minister Netanyahu, having just cobbled together a relatively weak coalition government, is already apparently signaling a willingness to take these sorts of steps. If this is a correct report, and maybe it's not, I hope it's not. But if, let's just say for the purpose of discussion, it is, I really fear, and I know Bill Langfan really fears, that what is being teed up now is a kind of, well, call it Munich 2.0, in which we once again not only witness, but preside over a weakening of a nation whose self-reliance and capacity to defend itself is obviously critical to its own future security, but also to ours. So this is a moment when, more than ever, I believe we need organizations like the ZOA. I am so proud of Mort and all of you for standing up against Chuck Hagel. That was a signal. me to say that again. That was a signal evidence of your character. And it spoke volumes that you were basically alone. And not only that, but as Mort has told you, that he was subjected, as he often is, to vitriol and condemnation and pressure to go along. And what's so painful as a non-Jew, but as a friend of this community, as a believer in its importance to Israel and to our security, is to see how many others, all of whom, let's face it, have more money at their disposal than you do, and are considered to be more powerful in the Jewish lobby, as Chuck Hagel likes to call it, than some of these other organizations. But the point is that, flashing back to what Mark Langfan's father witnessed, and what we all say will never be allowed to happen again, is precisely the kind of behavior that was exhibited by Jews who marched into the gas chambers because they didn't want to make trouble. They wanted to hope for the best, not to give offense. Well, it's time, ladies and gentlemen, to give offense to those who believe that never again is a slogan that no longer applies. It is time not simply to say this to one another in a group of like-minded Jews and Christians, but to those who do not agree with you. Because they too will be facing this peril. It's not just our friends in Israel. Trust me on this. This is a problem here too. Mention was made by Lee of our book, Sharia, the Threat to America. I commend it to you. One of the people who was principally responsible for pulling it together is in the back of the room with me, my esteemed Chief Operating Officer at the Center, Christine Brim. I encourage you to say hello to her. This is a book that talks about the same threat that really fundamentally is animating the peril to Israel, and that is metastasizing here, as well as in Europe and Canada and other parts of what we think of as the free world. Did you know that, just as an example, there are 45 foreign-born maids who are threatened with beheading in Thailand at the moment for having offended Sharia blasphemy laws? This is just an example of a rot that is now present in a lot of different places. And we've been spending some time just in the past day talking about how this phenomenon of Sharia, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this term. This is, of course, not simply religious law that some Muslims, not all of them, thank God, but many of them, those who are considered to be the most orthodox, if you can use that term, certainly the most faithful to the teachings of Muhammad and the practices laid out in the various sacred texts of Islam. But beyond the bit of religious, direction, how often you pray and in which direction and what you wash and so on, you're familiar with some of these strictures in your own faith. There is roughly 90% of Sharia that is actually about all other kinds of things, governing relationships. A man to his wife, or